My brother, my sister, imagine a person holding ice tightly in their hands, thinking it will last forever. But slowly, the ice melts, and the tighter they hold it, the faster it disappears. That is exactly how dunya is. People change, attention fades, feelings disappear. And maybe lately, Allah is teaching your heart to stop depending on things that were never meant to stay forever. Because sometimes, Allah makes people feel emotionally distant, so you finally become closer to Him. When Allah wants to save your soul, He makes people feel emotionally distant, my brother, my sister. One of the strangest feelings a person can experience is this. You are surrounded by people, yet your heart still feels disconnected. The same people you once laughed with no longer bring the same comfort. The same conversations no longer touch your soul. Even the attention you once craved starts feeling emotionally exhausting. And honestly, this feeling can scare you. Because part of you starts wondering, what happened to me? Why do I suddenly feel distant from everyone? Why does my heart no longer feel attached the same way? And sometimes you even feel guilty for it. You try forcing yourself to feel connected again. You try forcing excitement into conversations. You try forcing emotional closeness. But deep inside, something has changed. And maybe the reason this feels so painful is because nobody prepared you for the fact that spiritual growth often begins with emotional detachment. You see, when Allah wants to guide a soul back to Him, He sometimes removes the emotional sweetness from worldly attachments first. Not because people are evil, not because relationships are worthless, but because your heart slowly became too dependent on creation. Subhanallah. Many people do not realize how emotionally attached they are to people until Allah creates distance between them. Some people depend on text to feel valuable. Some depend on attention to feel worthy. Some depend on constant companionship to escape loneliness. And over time, their hearts unknowingly begin relying on people more than Allah. That is when emotional dependence becomes dangerous. Because people are unstable. Human beings change constantly. One day they love you deeply. The next day they become distant. One day they promise forever. The next day they disappear without explanation. And Allah knows your heart was never designed to build its peace upon unstable things. Your heart was created to find peace in Him. But sometimes, Allah has to empty certain emotional attachments from your chest before your soul can fully return to Him. And this process feels uncomfortable because detachment feels like loss before it feels like peace. At first, you think something is wrong with you. You think you are becoming cold, emotionless, disconnected. But maybe the reality is much deeper than that. Maybe Allah is slowly saving your soul from emotional slavery. Because there is a type of attachment that quietly destroys people. The attachment to being constantly emotionally needed, constantly emotionally validated, constantly emotionally reassured by others. And once your happiness depends entirely on people, your peace becomes fragile. One ignored message ruins your mood. One dry conversation ruins your night. One person changing their energy makes your chest heavy for days. This is exhausting for the soul. And Allah does not want you emotionally imprisoned by creation. Allah wants your heart free. Free from obsession, free from desperation, free from needing people to constantly fill emptiness only Allah can heal. My brother, sometimes Allah isolates a believer emotionally before elevating them spiritually. Because noise blocks reflection, distraction blocks self-awareness. An endless attachment to people can distract the heart from its creator. That is why many believers experience a season where they suddenly feel emotionally withdrawn from everyone. Not because they hate people, but because their soul is changing. Their heart is becoming more sensitive, more aware, more spiritually awake. The things that once entertained them no longer satisfy them. The conversations that once felt exciting now feel shallow. The gatherings that once felt comforting now feel draining. And honestly, this confuses many people because nobody talks about this stage of spiritual growth. Nobody talks about the loneliness that sometimes comes before closeness to Allah. Nobody talks about the silence Allah places inside your life before rebuilding your heart. But wallahi, some of the deepest transformations happen in these quiet seasons. Because when people become emotionally distant, you finally hear your own soul clearly again. You finally notice how emotionally exhausted you became from constantly chasing closeness from human beings. You finally realize how much energy you spent trying to feel chosen by people, while forgetting that Allah already chose you to be His servant. Subhanallah, that realization changes everything. Because the believer eventually understands. Human love is beautiful, but it can never replace closeness to Allah. People can comfort you temporarily, but only Allah can heal the emptiness inside your chest completely. People can support you temporarily, But only Allah remains when everyone else changes. And maybe that is exactly what Allah is teaching your heart right now. Maybe He is teaching you to stop building your identity around people's attention. Maybe He is teaching you that your worth does not decrease when people become distant. Maybe He is teaching you emotional independence. Because one of the strongest believers is not the one who has the most people around them. It is the one whose heart remains stable even when people leave. And this level of strength only comes when your relationship with Allah becomes deeper than your attachment to creation. My brother, my sister, do not misunderstand this message. Islam does not teach us to hate people. Islam does not teach isolation from the world. We still love, we still care, we still show mercy. But we stop depending on people for the things only Allah can provide. That is the difference. A believer loves people without worshipping their attention. A believer appreciates companionship without emotionally collapsing when companionship disappears. A believer cares deeply, but keeps the heart connected to Allah above everything else. And honestly, perhaps your heart is learning this lesson now. Perhaps Allah saw that certain attachments were slowly damaging your peace. Perhaps Allah saw you emotionally over-investing in people who could never carry the weight of your soul. So He slowly pulled your heart away, not to destroy you, but to protect you, to rebuild you, to remind you where real peace comes from. Because sometimes Allah removes emotional dependency from your life, so your soul can finally breathe again. And one day, you will realize this distance was not abandonment, it was mercy. It was Allah teaching your heart that no matter how distant people become, He will always remain near. Your heart is exhausted from loving people who never truly understood you, my brother, my sister. Sometimes emotional detachment is not caused by hatred. It is caused by exhaustion. Deep emotional exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that builds quietly over the years. The kind nobody notices because you kept smiling while carrying it. You kept showing up for people, kept listening to people, kept supporting people, kept forgiving people, kept being emotionally available whenever someone needed you. But slowly your heart became tired, because one of the most painful feelings in life is giving sincere love to people who never truly understand your soul. You explain your feelings, yet they misunderstand you. You stay loyal to them, yet they question your intentions. You carry them emotionally, yet they disappear when your own heart becomes heavy. And after enough disappointment, something inside you changes. You stop expecting the same closeness from people. You stop opening your heart so easily. You stop feeling emotionally excited around everyone. Not because you became arrogant, not because you stopped caring, but because your soul became exhausted from pouring love into places where it was never fully valued. Subhanallah, many sensitive people silently suffer like this. They love deeply, care deeply, sacrifice deeply, but because they give so much emotionally, they also get hurt more deeply than others. And eventually, their heart reaches a point where it can no longer keep carrying emotional disappointment the same way. So the soul begins withdrawing, quietly, slowly, without warning. You start noticing it in small ways first. You reply less. You isolate more. You enjoy silence more. You stop explaining yourself during every misunderstanding. You stop chasing people who pull away. And honestly, part of you feels guilty for changing because you remember how emotionally open you used to be. You remember when you trusted easily, when conversations felt effortless, when your heart felt alive around people. But pain changes people, especially repeated pain, especially when the wounds come from people you genuinely loved. My brother, one of the hardest realities to accept is this: not everyone knows how to handle a sincere heart. Some people only appreciate you when you are useful to them. Some only love the version of you that benefits them emotionally. Some enjoy your softness until your pain becomes inconvenient for them. And this realization breaks something inside a person, because you begin understanding that not everybody loves with sincerity. Not everybody protects hearts carefully. Not everybody values loyalty. That is why your soul suddenly feels tired around certain people now. Because your heart can sense what your mind ignored for years. It can sense one-sided effort, forced connection, fake concern, surface-level love. And honestly, the soul becomes very heavy when it constantly gives emotional energy to relationships that never truly nourish it. That is why some people feel more peaceful alone than surrounded by others. Not because they hate companionship, but because fake connection is more exhausting than solitude. Subhanallah, sometimes Allah allows your heart to become emotionally detached from certain people because He knows the connection is hurting you more than helping you. And maybe you kept trying to save relationships Allah was quietly trying to pull you away from. Maybe you kept begging for closeness from people who were slowly draining your peace. Maybe you became emotionally addicted to being needed by people while your own soul was quietly collapsing inside. And Allah saw it all. Allah saw every night you overthought conversations. Every moment you felt emotionally ignored. Every time you stayed loyal to people who gave you half-hearted effort. Every silent disappointment you never spoke about. Allah saw the emotional burden your heart was carrying. And perhaps this emotional detachment is not punishment. Perhaps it is protection. Because sometimes Allah removes emotional intensity from your heart to save you from further heartbreak. He makes certain people feel emotionally distant, so you stop depending on them so heavily. Because dependence on people always creates fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being forgotten, fear of not being loved the same way. And these fears slowly consume the heart. But when Allah begins healing a believer, He slowly weakens unhealthy emotional attachments. This process feels lonely at first, because your soul is adjusting. You are learning how to survive emotionally without constantly seeking reassurance from people. And this is difficult, especially for people who spent their whole life searching for emotional safety through others. But eventually, the believer learns something life-changing. People can support you, but they cannot complete you. People can comfort you, but they cannot heal every wound inside you. People can love you, but they cannot replace Allah in your heart. And once this realization enters the soul, your entire emotional world changes. You stop begging people to understand you. You stop exhausting yourself trying to prove your worth. You stop chasing affection that feels forced, because your heart finally realizes real peace was never supposed to come from people. Real peace comes from Allah. My brother, my sister, there is a reason Allah repeatedly reminds us that this dunya is temporary, because everything in it changes. Feelings change, people change. Relationships change. Even the people who once promised they would never leave sometimes become strangers. And if your entire emotional stability depends on human beings, your heart will constantly live in fear. But Allah wants more for you than that. He wants your heart attached to something eternal, something stable, something that never abandons you, Him. That is why some seasons of detachment are actually sacred, painful, but sacred. Because Allah is teaching your heart how to return to Him after depending too heavily on creation. And wallahi, one day you will look back at this emotional distance and realize your soul was not dying, it was awakening. Awakening to the painful truth that not everybody deserves unlimited access to your heart. Awakening to the reality that some people only knew your kindness, but never truly understood your pain. Awakening to the understanding that your worth does not decrease because people fail to value you properly. And perhaps most importantly, awakening to the fact that Allah was always enough for your heart, even when people were not. Allah removes emotional attachments before He elevates a believer. My brother, my sister, one of the most painful things the soul experiences is watching itself slowly detach from things it once could not live without. People you once waited for all day suddenly stop feeling emotionally necessary. Conversations that once controlled your mood no longer affect you the same way. The need for constant reassurance begins fading. And honestly, this stage can feel terrifying because part of you starts wondering if your heart is becoming cold. You start questioning yourself. Why do I not feel emotionally attached the same way anymore? Why does attention no longer satisfy me? Why do I suddenly enjoy silence more than conversation? But maybe this is not emotional emptiness. Maybe Allah is preparing your soul for elevation, because one of the first things Allah removes before raising a believer is unhealthy emotional dependence on creation. You see, many people want spiritual elevation while their hearts are still chained to people, chained to validation, chained to attention, chained to emotional reassurance. But a heart completely controlled by people cannot fully belong to Allah, and Allah knows this. So before He raises certain believers, He slowly detaches them from dunya emotionally. Not completely, but enough for their heart to breathe again, enough for their soul to stop worshipping people's attention. Subhanallah, some people are emotionally addicted without realizing it. Addicted to being constantly noticed, constantly texted, constantly reassured, constantly emotionally desired. And when these things disappear, their peace disappears too. Their confidence collapses. Their heart panics because their emotional stability was built upon people instead of Allah. And honestly, this is one of the most exhausting ways to live. To constantly depend on unstable human beings for emotional security, because people change. People become distant, people disappoint, people leave. Even good people cannot constantly carry your emotional needs. Only Allah can do that perfectly. That is why Allah sometimes removes emotional intensity from certain relationships. Because He wants your soul to stop depending on temporary things for permanent peace. My brother, there are believers Allah wants to elevate spiritually. But first He must free their heart. Free it from obsession. Free it from desperation. Free it from emotional slavery to creation. And this freedom feels lonely in the beginning because the soul goes through withdrawal. You miss the emotional highs. You miss constantly feeling wanted. You miss having people emotionally attached to you. But slowly, Allah replaces that chaos with something calmer, something deeper, something more stable, inner peace. Because real peace enters the heart when your emotions stop depending entirely on people. And perhaps that is exactly what Allah is teaching you right now. Maybe Allah is teaching you how to emotionally survive without chasing everyone. How to remain calm when people become distant. How to stop collapsing every time someone changes toward you. Because one of the signs of emotional maturity is this. You stop needing constant reassurance to feel valuable. Subhanallah, look at how many people destroy themselves emotionally trying to hold on to unstable relationships. They overthink every message, analyze every tone change, beg for consistency, fear abandonment every day. And slowly, their peace disappears completely. Why? Because their heart became attached to people more than Allah. But when Allah begins healing a believer, He slowly removes this emotional dependency. He teaches the soul, your peace cannot come from people alone. And honestly, this lesson hurts. Because detachment always feels like loss before it feels like freedom. At first, you feel empty. You feel emotionally disconnected. You feel unfamiliar to yourself. But eventually, you realize something powerful. You are no longer emotionally controlled by every little thing people do. You stop obsessing over who texts first. You stop overthinking every conversation. You stop begging people to stay. You stop feeling destroyed whenever someone pulls away. Because your heart slowly becomes anchored in Allah instead of creation. And wallahi, that changes everything. Because once Allah becomes the center of your emotional stability, people lose the power to break you so easily. Not because you stop loving people, but because your soul finally understands balance. You learn to love without attachment destroying you. You learn to care without losing yourself. You learn to appreciate people without emotionally worshipping their presence. And this is one of the strongest forms of emotional freedom a believer can experience. My brother, many people misunderstand spiritual growth. Think becoming closer to Allah only means praying more. But sometimes spiritual growth looks like emotional detachment first. Allah removes distractions from your heart. He weakens unhealthy attachments. He makes certain conversations feel empty. Certain relationships feel draining. Certain environments feel heavy. Because your soul is evolving. The things that once entertained you no longer satisfy you spiritually. And honestly, this stage often feels isolating. Because while everyone around you still chases dunya, your heart quietly begins craving something deeper. Peace, meaning, closeness to Allah. And perhaps this is why you suddenly feel emotionally different lately. Perhaps Allah is preparing your soul for a level of peace you could never experience while emotionally addicted to people. Because emotional addiction creates anxiety, but reliance upon Allah creates stability. Subhanallah, the strongest believer is not the one who never feels pain. It is the one whose heart still remains steady even after disappointment. The one who still trusts Allah after betrayal. The one who still finds peace in sujood after people fail them. The one whose emotional world no longer collapses every time human beings change. And maybe Allah is building that strength inside you now. Maybe this emotional distance is training your soul, teaching your heart endurance, teaching your heart independence from creation. Because elevation requires emotional discipline. Allah cannot raise a heart that is completely enslaved by people's opinions and attention. So before elevation comes detachment. Before peace comes isolation. Before emotional freedom comes the painful process of releasing unhealthy attachments. And my brother, my sister, this process may feel uncomfortable now, but one day you will realize it was mercy. Because Allah was not trying to empty your heart. He was trying to free it from over-dependence, free it from emotional obsession, free it from chasing love in places that could never fully heal you. And once your heart becomes truly attached to Allah, you begin experiencing a type of peace people cannot take away from you anymore. A peace not controlled by messages, not controlled by attention, not controlled by relationships, but a peace rooted in knowing that even if people become distant, Allah never does. The more pain your heart survives, the more silent you become, my brother, my sister. There is a type of pain that changes the way a person speaks forever. Not loud pain, Not dramatic pain, but quiet pain, the kind that slowly teaches the heart to stop explaining itself, the kind that teaches the soul silence. Because after enough disappointment, after enough betrayal, after enough nights crying quietly while pretending to be okay during the day, something inside a person changes. You stop talking as much. You stop expressing every emotion. You stop telling everyone what hurts you. And honestly, many people misunderstand this stage. They think you became cold. They think you became distant. But the truth is, your heart simply became tired. Tired of reopening wounds people never cared to understand properly. Tired of explaining pain to people who only listened halfway. Tired of being emotionally vulnerable in a world that often treats soft hearts carelessly. Subhanallah, pain matures a believer in ways comfort never can. Because some lessons only enter the soul after heartbreak, after abandonment, after disappointment. And one of the first things pain teaches you is this: not everybody deserves access to your deepest emotions. So slowly, the believer becomes quieter, not because they no longer feel emotions deeply, but because they feel them too deeply. There is a difference. Sensitive souls often become silent after pain because they realize how dangerous vulnerability can be in the wrong hands. You tell someone your struggles, and later they use your weakness against you. You open your heart sincerely, and later they abandon you without warning. You stay loyal through their difficult moments, yet when your own soul starts drowning, they suddenly disappear. And after enough experiences like this, the heart naturally becomes more guarded, more careful, more selective. My brother, there are some wounds people never fully recover from. Not because Allah abandoned them, but because certain scars permanently change how the soul interacts with the world. A person who has been deeply hurt no longer trusts easily, no longer opens up easily, no longer feels emotionally safe everywhere. And perhaps that is exactly where your heart is right now. You still care about people, you still love people, but you no longer have the emotional energy to constantly explain yourself because pain exhausted you. Subhanallah, sometimes Allah allows repeated disappointment not to destroy your heart, but to redirect it, to teach you not to place your deepest emotional trust in creation. Because people are imperfect. Even sincere people disappoint sometimes. Even people who love you can fail you emotionally. That is why Allah never told us to build our emotional foundation upon human beings. He taught us to build it upon Him. Because Allah never changes. Allah never abandons. Allah never misunderstands your silent tears. And perhaps your silence lately is not weakness. Perhaps it is your soul slowly returning to Allah after being wounded too many times by dunya. Because honestly, many believers become quieter as they grow spiritually. They stop arguing unnecessarily, stop chasing validation, stop over-explaining themselves, stop trying to make everyone understand them. Why? Because pain taught them that peace is more valuable than attention. And wallahi, that lesson changes a person deeply. You start protecting your energy differently. You stop giving everyone emotional access to you. You become careful about who enters your inner world, because you finally understand how fragile the heart can become after repeated disappointment. My brother, one of the loneliest feelings in life is suffering silently while everyone assumes you are okay. You smile, you function normally, you continue speaking kindly. But inside, your soul feels exhausted, and perhaps nobody realizes how many emotional battles you fought quietly. Battles against overthinking, against heartbreak, against loneliness, against disappointment, against the heavy feeling of not feeling understood. And honestly, some people become silent because speaking no longer feels safe emotionally. Every time they opened their heart before, they were hurt afterward. So silence became protection, not arrogance, protection. And perhaps Allah allowed this silence because He wants your heart to stop seeking healing from people alone. Maybe Allah wants you to experience the kind of peace that comes directly from Him. Because there are wounds human beings cannot heal. Only Allah can heal them. Only Allah can calm certain storms inside the chest. Only Allah fully understands the tears you never explain to anyone. Subhanallah, sometimes the quietest people are carrying the heaviest emotional burdens. But at the same time, those quiet seasons often bring the deepest spiritual growth. Because when the believer stops running toward people emotionally, they slowly begin running toward Allah instead. Their sujood becomes longer. Their du'as become more sincere. Their relationship with Allah becomes more personal. Not because life became easier, but because pain finally humbled the soul enough to realize no human being can carry my heart the way Allah can. And this realization changes everything. Because once the believer starts depending on Allah emotionally, the world loses much of its power over them. People still matter, but they no longer control the believer's peace completely. Disappointment still hurts, but it no longer destroys the soul completely. Why? Because the heart now has somewhere deeper to return. Allah. My brother, my sister, do not hate yourself for becoming quieter lately. Not every silence means something is wrong with you. Sometimes silence means your soul is healing. Sometimes silence means your heart is thinking more deeply about life. Sometimes silence means Allah is protecting you from speaking from pain. And sometimes silence is simply the result of surviving things nobody knows about. Because pain changes people quietly, not always loudly. Some people cry more after heartbreak. Others become silent. Some people chase attention after being hurt. Others withdraw from the world emotionally. And perhaps your soul chose silence because it became tired of explaining wounds words could never fully describe. But wallahi, Allah understands every unspoken feeling inside your chest. Every disappointment you buried, every tear you hid, every night you felt emotionally overwhelmed while pretending to be strong. Allah saw it all. And maybe your silence lately is not the death of your personality. Maybe it is the rebirth of your soul. Maybe Allah is removing noise from your life so your heart can finally hear Him clearly again. Because sometimes, before Allah gives a believer peace, He first teaches them silence. Some people were draining your peace without you realizing it. My brother, my sister, sometimes the reason you suddenly feel emotionally detached from certain people is because your soul finally became honest about how heavy those relationships were making your heart feel. Not every relationship destroys you loudly. Some relationships destroy you slowly, quietly, emotionally. You do not notice it at first. Because you keep telling yourself, they care about me, they are part of my life, I should stay loyal. But deep inside, your peace keeps disappearing around them. Your chest feels heavier after every conversation. Your mind feels exhausted after spending time with them. And somehow, even when they smile at you, your soul still feels emotionally unsafe. Subhanallah, the heart notices energy before the mind accepts reality. Sometimes your soul becomes tired long before your eyes finally understand why. Because not every person around you carries peace. Some people carry confusion, some carry negativity, some carry hidden jealousy, some carry emotional chaos. And if you stay emotionally attached to draining people for too long, their heaviness slowly enters your own heart. That is why certain believers suddenly begin withdrawing emotionally from people they once felt deeply connected to. Not because they became cruel, but because their soul became exhausted. You see, there are people who constantly take emotional energy from you, but never refill your heart with peace. Every conversation becomes emotionally draining. Every interaction feels heavy. You constantly overthink after speaking to them. You constantly feel pressured to maintain the relationship. And eventually, your soul reaches a breaking point. Because the heart was never designed to carry endless emotional stress from unhealthy relationships. My brother, one of the hardest truths to accept is this. Not everybody around you wants peace for you. Some people enjoy access to your energy, but secretly compete with your happiness. Some people love being emotionally needed by you because it gives them control over your emotions. Some people keep you emotionally attached while giving you the bare minimum in return. And honestly, sensitive people suffer the most in these relationships because they keep trying to see the good in everyone. They keep excusing harmful behavior. They keep sacrificing their peace to avoid hurting others. Until one day, their own soul becomes exhausted. And perhaps that is exactly what happened to you. Perhaps your emotional detachment is not random. Perhaps Allah finally allowed your heart to feel the emotional weight certain people were placing upon you for years. Because sometimes Allah protects a believer by removing emotional attachment before removing the person physically. First, your heart disconnects, then your life changes afterward. Subhanallah. Many people ignore emotional warning signs because they are too attached. They ignore how anxious certain people make them feel. Ignore how emotionally unstable they become around certain relationships. Ignore how their peace disappears whenever specific people enter their life again. Why? Because emotional attachment blinds the heart. And honestly, that blindness can destroy a person slowly. You keep holding on to relationships that Allah is trying to free you from. You keep begging for closeness from people who are quietly damaging your mental peace. You keep chasing emotional reassurance from individuals who leave your heart feeling emptier every time. And wallahi, this emotional exhaustion becomes unbearable after a while. Because fake closeness is one of the most painful experiences for the soul. To sit around people, yet still feel emotionally alone. To give love, yet constantly feel emotionally drained afterward. To remain loyal, yet secretly feel your peace disappearing more and more every day. My brother, Allah did not create your heart to survive inside constant emotional chaos. Allah created your heart for sakina, for peace, for emotional stability rooted in Him. But some relationships pull you away from that peace completely. Some relationships increase anxiety instead of calmness, increase overthinking instead of clarity, increase emotional dependencies instead of emotional maturity. And perhaps Allah saw that your heart was drowning emotionally. Perhaps He saw how certain people were consuming your energy slowly. Perhaps He saw how much emotional effort you were giving while receiving very little peace in return. So Allah slowly created distance, not to punish you, but to save your heart before it completely collapsed. Because sometimes the most merciful thing Allah does is weaken your emotional attachment to people who are draining your soul. And honestly, this process hurts because you still care about them. Part of you still misses them. Part of you still remembers the good moments. But at the same time, your soul no longer feels safe there. And this inner conflict confuses many believers. They wonder, if I still care about them, why do I suddenly feel emotionally detached? Because caring about someone and feeling spiritually peaceful around them are not always the same thing. Some people can be familiar to you while still being unhealthy for your soul. Subhanallah. One of the signs Allah is protecting your peace is this. Your heart no longer feels emotionally excited by chaos. You stop craving unstable attention. You stop chasing draining people. You stop forcing relationships that constantly wound your heart. And slowly, solitude starts feeling lighter than fake companionship. Not because you hate people, but because your soul finally tasted the difference between peace and emotional exhaustion. My brother, many believers stay trapped in painful relationships simply because they fear loneliness. They fear being alone, fear losing connection, fear emotional emptiness. So they continue tolerating relationships that slowly destroy their peace. But wallahi, being alone with Allah is far less dangerous than being emotionally attached to people who constantly disturb your heart. Because unhealthy attachment creates emotional slavery. You start depending on people who keep hurting you, depending on people who only remember you when convenient, depending on people whose inconsistency constantly damages your emotional stability. And Allah wants better for you than that. Allah wants your heart emotionally free, free from toxic dependency, free from emotional manipulation, free from constantly begging people for the bare minimum. And perhaps this emotional detachment you feel lately is Allah teaching your soul how to choose peace over attachment, how to walk away from emotional chaos without guilt, how to stop confusing suffering with loyalty. Because staying connected to people who drain your soul is not always loyalty. Sometimes it is self-destruction. And honestly, one of the greatest acts of emotional maturity is realizing this. Not every relationship deserves permanent access to your heart. Some people were only temporary lessons. Some people entered your life to expose wounds you still needed to heal. Some people showed you how emotionally dependent you had become on human attention. And some people were removed because Allah knew your peace could never grow while they remained too deeply attached to your heart. So if your soul feels emotionally detached lately, do not rush to force old connections again. Do not immediately assume something is wrong with your heart. Maybe Allah is finally showing you which relationships nourish your soul and which ones slowly destroy it. Because one of the biggest signs of healing is this: your heart starts protecting its peace, even if it means emotionally distancing itself from people it once struggled to let go of. Your soul is no longer attracted to fake love, fake friendships, and empty connections, my brother, my sister. One of the clearest signs that your soul is changing spiritually is when fake connections stop satisfying you. The conversations that once entertained you suddenly feel empty. The attention that once excited you no longer touches your heart. The friendships built only on jokes, gossip, and temporary emotions start feeling emotionally exhausting. And honestly, this change can feel very lonely at first. Because suddenly, you no longer fit comfortably into the same environments that once felt normal to you. You sit around people, yet your soul feels disconnected. You hear the conversations, but your heart quietly withdraws. Not because you think you are better than anyone, but because your soul has become tired of surface level connection. Subhanallah, there comes a point in spiritual growth where the heart begins craving sincerity more than attention. You stop wanting relationships built only on convenience. You stop wanting friendships that only exist during good moments. You stop wanting fake emotional closeness from people who disappear when life becomes difficult. Because after enough disappointment, the soul begins searching for something deeper, something real, something peaceful, something connected to Allah. And honestly, this shift changes the believer completely. Before, you may have tolerated fake energy just to avoid loneliness. You kept forcing conversations, kept forcing friendships, kept forcing emotional closeness with people who never truly understood your soul. Why? Because part of you feared being alone, feared silence, feared emotional emptiness. But slowly, Allah begins healing that fear. And once that healing starts, your soul becomes less willing to tolerate fake connection simply for the sake of company. Because fake closeness drains the heart more than solitude ever could. My brother, there are relationships that look alive on the outside, but leave your soul starving internally. You laugh with people, yet still feel emotionally lonely afterward. You spend hours talking, yet your heart still feels unseen. You stay loyal, yet something inside your chest still feels heavy around them. And eventually, your soul becomes exhausted from pretending these connections fulfill you. Subhanallah, the believer's heart changes when Allah begins purifying it. Things that once satisfied the ego no longer satisfy the soul. Attention loses its power, validation loses its excitement. Superficial affection loses its emotional grip. Why? Because Allah is teaching the heart that dunya can never fully satisfy it. Only closeness to Allah can do that. And perhaps that is exactly why you feel emotionally detached lately. Perhaps your soul is no longer impressed by temporary things. Perhaps Allah removed the emotional sweetness from fake relationships so you would stop depending on them for peace. Because some people become emotionally addicted to shallow connection. They constantly need people around them, constantly need noise, constantly need attention. Not because they are fulfilled, but because they are afraid to sit alone with themselves, afraid to confront the emptiness inside their own soul. But Allah sometimes isolates a believer emotionally so they can finally face themselves honestly, so they can finally stop using people as distractions from their inner wounds. And honestly, this process is uncomfortable because when fake connection loses its attraction, the believer often enters a lonely stage, a stage where many old relationships no longer feel aligned with the soul, a stage where certain environments suddenly feel spiritually heavy, a stage where silence feels more peaceful than meaningless conversation. And many people misunderstand this stage completely. They think something is wrong with them. They think they became antisocial, emotionally numb, disconnected. But perhaps the reality is much deeper. Perhaps your soul is simply becoming more selective about what enters your heart. Because not every relationship deserves emotional access to you. Not every friendship deserves deep attachment. And not every smiling face carries sincere intentions. My brother, one of the most dangerous things in life is fake love. Love that sounds beautiful, but secretly destroys your peace. Love that keeps you emotionally attached, while slowly weakening your self-worth. Love that only appears when convenient. Love that disappears the moment you struggle emotionally. And honestly, many believers spend years hurting themselves, trying to maintain relationships Allah already showed them were unhealthy. But because the heart becomes emotionally attached, it keeps ignoring the warning signs, ignoring the anxiety, ignoring the emotional heaviness, ignoring the way the soul keeps feeling drained afterward. Until eventually, Allah removes the emotional attachment Himself, and that is when detachment begins. You suddenly stop feeling emotionally excited around certain people. You stop craving certain conversations. You stop chasing connection with individuals who once controlled your emotions completely. And honestly, part of you feels confused by this change because the old version of you would have done anything to keep those connections alive. But healing changes the heart. Spiritual growth changes attraction. Your soul no longer wants relationships built only on temporary emotions. It wants sincerity, peace, loyalty, emotional safety. And most importantly, it wants relationships that bring you closer to Allah instead of further away from Him. Subhanallah, when Allah begins purifying your heart, He changes what your soul is attracted to. You stop admiring loud people with empty hearts. You stop chasing emotionally unavailable people. You stop craving validation from those who barely value you. Because your soul begins understanding something powerful. Not every connection deserves emotional investment. Some people only enter your life to test your attachment. Some friendships only exist to teach you boundaries. Some relationships expose how much emotional dependency still exists inside your heart. And once the believer learns these lessons, they become more careful, more emotionally disciplined, more protective of their peace. My brother, do not fear this emotional detachment. Sometimes it is a sign your soul is healing. Healing from over-attachment, healing from emotional desperation, healing from constantly trying to feel worthy through human attention. Because once Allah becomes enough for your heart, fake love loses much of its power over you. You no longer chase people who give inconsistent energy. You no longer beg for emotional reassurance. You no longer force closeness where peace does not exist. Why? Because your soul finally understands this dunya cannot fully satisfy the heart. Only Allah can. And wallahi, that realization changes everything. Because when your heart becomes attached to Allah first, you stop accepting empty connection just to avoid loneliness. You stop tolerating fake friendships just to feel included. You stop sacrificing your peace simply because you fear people leaving. Instead, your heart becomes calmer, stronger, more emotionally independent, not cold, not emotionless, just wiser. Wiser about who deserves closeness, wiser about what kind of relationships nourish the soul, and wiser about the painful truth that some connections feel beautiful emotionally, while quietly destroying your peace spiritually. So if your soul suddenly feels detached from fake love and shallow relationships lately, do not panic. Perhaps Allah is not removing your ability to love. Perhaps He is purifying the way you love, teaching your heart to seek sincerity instead of attention, depth instead of distraction, peace instead of emotional chaos. And most importantly, teaching your soul that the purest connection you will ever experience is the one between your heart and Allah. Allah is teaching you how to live without emotionally depending on people, my brother, my sister. One of the hardest lessons Allah teaches a believer is this: how to survive emotionally without depending on people for peace. Because many of us were never taught emotional independence. We were taught to search for comfort in people, to search for worth in attention, to search for emotional security in relationships. So naturally, when people become distant, our hearts panic. When someone changes toward us, our peace collapses. When affection disappears, we suddenly feel empty inside. And honestly, this emotional dependency destroys many people silently, because their happiness becomes controlled by human beings. Their emotional stability becomes controlled by replies, by attention, by validation, by how loved they feel by creation. And eventually, their heart becomes exhausted. Subhanallah, many believers do not realize how emotionally dependent they became until Allah creates distance between them and people they heavily relied on. Suddenly, the conversations become less frequent. The emotional closeness weakens, the attention fades, and the believer feels lost. Not because they lost people, but because they built too much emotional dependence upon those people. And perhaps this is exactly why Allah sometimes allows emotional distance. Because He wants to free your heart before attachment completely consumes your peace. My brother, there is a dangerous kind of attachment where a person slowly begins expecting from people what only Allah can truly provide. Constant emotional reassurance, constant emotional healing, constant emotional security. But human beings are imperfect. No person can constantly carry your emotional needs without eventually disappointing you somehow. That is why hearts break so easily when they rely too heavily on creation. Because people change, people become distracted, people fail, people leave. Even sincere people cannot fill every emptiness inside your soul. Only Allah can do that completely. And perhaps Allah is teaching your heart this lesson right now. Perhaps that is why you suddenly feel emotionally detached from everyone lately. Because Allah is slowly removing your dependence on people, so your soul can finally depend on Him first. And honestly, this process feels painful in the beginning, because emotional dependence behaves almost like addiction. You become addicted to being checked on, addicted to attention, addicted to emotional reassurance, addicted to feeling emotionally chosen by someone. So when Allah starts removing excessive attachment from your heart, withdrawal begins. You feel lonely, restless, emotionally empty. You keep wanting to return to old emotional patterns. You keep craving the same people who once gave your heart temporary comfort. But slowly, Allah teaches the believer something deeper. That peace built upon people will always remain unstable, because human beings are temporary, but Allah is eternal. Subhanallah, one of the strongest forms of healing is when a believer learns how to emotionally calm themselves through Allah instead of constantly running toward people. Learning how to sit alone without feeling abandoned. Learning how to survive silence without panicking. Learning how to carry sadness without desperately searching for distraction. And honestly, most people never reach this level of emotional maturity because they spend their whole life escaping themselves through relationships, escaping loneliness through attention, escaping emptiness through constant companionship. But Allah sometimes isolates a believer emotionally, not to hurt them, but to strengthen them. because some hearts can only grow in solitude. Some lessons can only be learned in silence. Some believers only discover Allah deeply after people disappoint them repeatedly. And perhaps your soul is entering that stage now. A stage where Allah is teaching you emotional discipline, teaching you how to stop collapsing every time people change, teaching you how to remain emotionally stable even when others become distant, teaching you how to find comfort in sujud instead of seeking constant emotional rescue from creation. My brother, there is a huge difference between loving people and emotionally depending on them. Islam teaches love of mercy, compassion, connection, but Islam does not teach emotional slavery to people. It does not teach building your entire peace upon unstable human beings. Because once your emotional survival depends entirely on people, fear enters the heart constantly. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not being loved enough, fear of losing attention. And this fear slowly destroys inner peace. But when Allah becomes your emotional foundation, something powerful happens. People can still disappoint you, but they no longer destroy you completely. Distance still hurts, but it no longer shatters your identity. Loneliness still exists, but it no longer feels unbearable. Why? Because your heart now has somewhere permanent to return. Allah. And wallahi, this is one of the greatest emotional freedoms a believer can experience. To love people sincerely, without emotionally drowning when they change. To care deeply, without losing yourself completely inside attachment. To appreciate companionship, without needing it every second to feel worthy. And honestly, perhaps Allah is preparing your soul for this freedom now. Perhaps that is why old emotional dependencies are fading. Because Allah wants your heart stronger than before, not hard. Not emotionless, strong. There is a difference. A strong believer still loves, still cares, still feels emotions deeply. But their peace no longer depends entirely on how people treat them. Their peace comes from knowing Allah remains near even when creation becomes distant. Subhanallah, many people spend years begging others for emotional reassurance while forgetting that Allah continuously invites them toward Him through salah, through dua, through tahajjud, through Quran, through quiet moments alone. But because the dunya is noisy, people become addicted to human attention instead. And perhaps Allah is removing some of that noise from your life right now, removing certain attachments, certain distractions, certain emotional dependencies, so your soul can finally hear Him clearly again. Because sometimes Allah removes people from the center of your heart so He can return to the center Himself. And honestly, this transformation changes a believer completely. You stop chasing people obsessively. You stop begging for emotional consistency from unstable hearts. You stop panicking every time someone becomes distant. Because your soul slowly learns, if Allah is with me, I am not abandoned. My brother, my sister, do not fear this season of emotional detachment. Sometimes it is not loneliness. Sometimes it is training your soul to stop depending on temporary things for permanent peace. Training your heart to stand emotionally without constantly leaning on creation. Training your iman to become deeper than your attachment to people. And perhaps one day you will look back at this painful season and realize Allah was not removing love from your life. He was removing emotional dependency from your heart because He wanted you emotionally free. Free from desperation, free from obsession, free from constantly needing people to fill spaces inside your soul only He can heal. And once your heart truly learns that lesson, you begin experiencing a peace this dunya can never fully take away from you again. The moment you stop chasing human attention, your heart finally finds peace, my brother, my sister. One of the most exhausting ways to live is constantly chasing human attention, chasing replies, chasing validation, chasing emotional reassurance, chasing people who make you feel temporarily important while secretly draining your peace at the same time. And honestly, many people do not even realize how addicted they became to attention until Allah starts removing it from their life. Suddenly, the messages become less frequent. The emotional energy changes. The people who once gave you constant attention slowly become distant, and your heart begins feeling restless, empty, confused, because attention had quietly become emotional oxygen for your soul. Subhanallah, this dunya trains people to constantly seek validation from creation. Social media teaches you to measure your worth through reactions. People measure their value through who notices them, who praises them, who checks on them, who desires them. And slowly the heart becomes emotionally dependent on being seen by others. But wallahi, this kind of dependence destroys inner peace because human attention is unstable. Today people admire you. Tomorrow they forget you. Today they praise you. Tomorrow they criticize you. Today they make you feel important. Tomorrow they replace you with someone else. And if your emotional stability depends on human attention, your heart will never truly rest, because you will spend your whole life trying to maintain people's approval, trying to stay emotionally relevant, trying to keep everyone interested in you. And honestly, this pressure silently exhausts the soul. My brother, there are people who spend years emotionally performing for others, pretending to be happier than they are, pretending to be stronger than they are, pretending to be constantly okay. Why? Because they fear losing attention, fear being forgotten, fear feeling emotionally invisible. But eventually, Allah allows certain believers to experience emotional detachment from people so they can finally break free from this addiction. And this process feels painful at first, because attention gives temporary emotional highs. It makes you feel wanted, desired, chosen, important. But the problem is this: the soul was never designed to survive on temporary emotional highs from creation. The soul was designed to find peace in Allah. And perhaps that is exactly what Allah is teaching you lately. Perhaps He is teaching your heart that peace and attention are not the same thing. Because many people receive endless attention, yet still feel emotionally empty inside, still anxious, still restless, still spiritually lost. Why? Because attention can entertain the ego, but it cannot heal the soul. Only Allah can heal the soul completely. Subhanallah. One of the biggest signs of spiritual growth is when the believer slowly stops craving constant validation from people. You stop needing everyone to understand you. Stop needing everyone to praise you. Stop needing constant reassurance to feel worthy. And honestly, this changes your entire emotional world. Because once attention loses its power over you, people lose much of their power over you too. You stop panicking when someone becomes distant. You stop feeling destroyed when replies become dry. You stop obsessing over who notices you and who does not. Because your heart slowly realizes something powerful. Your worth was never created by people's attention in the first place. Your worth comes from Allah. And wallahi, once the believer truly understands this, peace enters the soul differently. Because no matter how distant people become, Allah still sees you. No matter how ignored you feel by creation, Allah still hears you. No matter how emotionally forgotten you feel in this dunya, Allah still remembers you. And honestly, that realization heals a part of the soul human beings never could. My brother, many emotional problems come from constantly seeking fulfillment through people. People want everyone to approve of them, everyone to admire them, everyone to emotionally choose them. But this is impossible. No matter how kind you are, some people will misunderstand you. No matter how loyal you are, some people will still leave you. No matter how much love you give, some people will still fail to value your heart. And if your peace depends on always being appreciated by people, you will constantly suffer emotionally. That is why Allah slowly teaches the believer detachment, not detachment from love, but detachment from obsession with human approval. Because chasing people endlessly only exhausts the soul. Subhanallah, look at how much emotional pain comes from craving attention, overthinking messages, checking phones repeatedly, feeling anxious when someone changes energy, feeling emotionally worthless when ignored, feeling jealous when others receive more attention. This emotional slavery steals peace quietly. And perhaps Allah became tired of watching your heart suffer like this. Perhaps He saw how much energy you wasted trying to stay important in people's lives. Perhaps He saw how deeply your mood depended on human validation. So Allah slowly removed certain attachments, removed certain emotional highs, removed certain distractions, so your soul could finally rest. Because sometimes Allah removes attention from your life to teach your heart how to survive without it. And honestly, this lesson changes a believer forever. You begin enjoying privacy more. Silence feels calmer. Solitude feels healing instead of terrifying. You stop needing constant emotional stimulation to feel alive. And slowly, your relationship with Allah becomes more personal, more sincere. Because your heart is no longer constantly distracted trying to impress creation. My brother, there is a freedom very few people experience in this dunya. The freedom of no longer needing everyone's approval, no longer chasing emotional validation, no longer shaping your identity around people's opinions. And wallahi, this freedom feels like peace, real peace, the kind of peace that remains even when people misunderstand you, even when people become distant, even when people stop giving attention. Why? Because your soul finally found something deeper than human approval. Allah. Subhanallah. Once Allah becomes enough for the believer's heart, many worldly obsessions lose their emotional control. You stop desperately chasing relationships, stop forcing connection, stop begging people to stay. Because you realize if Allah wants someone in your life, they will remain. And if Allah removes someone, chasing them will never bring peace anyway. This realization calms the soul deeply, because now your trust shifts away from creation and back toward Allah. And perhaps that is why you suddenly feel emotionally detached lately. Perhaps Allah is teaching you how to stop seeking your value through human attention, teaching your heart how to exist without constant validation, teaching your soul how to feel worthy even in silence, because your worth was never tied to how much people notice you. Your worth was always tied to the fact that Allah created you, hears you, understands you, and continues inviting you back to Him despite every weakness inside you. My brother, my sister, one day you will realize this painful season of emotional detachment was actually mercy, because Allah was freeing your heart from one of the most exhausting addictions in dunya, the addiction to being emotionally needed by people. And once your heart breaks free from that addiction, peace finally enters your soul in a way attention never could. Not everyone deserves access to the softest parts of your heart, my brother, my sister. One painful lesson life eventually teaches every believer is this: not everybody deserves full access to your heart. Some people only know how to benefit from your softness, not protect it. You gave people loyalty, time, attention, understanding. And sometimes they repaid your sincerity with distance, betrayal, or emotional carelessness. That is why your heart became more guarded lately. Not because you stopped caring, but because pain taught you wisdom. Subhanallah, a soft heart is a blessing. But if you give it to the wrong people repeatedly, it slowly becomes exhausted. And perhaps Allah is teaching you now to stop opening your soul to everyone, to stop trusting every smiling face, to stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Because not every person who enters your life deserves permanent emotional access to you. Some people only come to test your attachment. Others come to teach you boundaries. And honestly, protecting your peace is not selfish, it is necessary. My brother, the believer eventually learns to love people with wisdom, to care without losing themselves, to help others without emotionally drowning for them. And wallahi, once your heart becomes attached to Allah first, you stop begging people to handle your softness carefully, because you realize the safest place for your heart was always with Allah. When Allah becomes enough for you, people lose the power to break you, my brother, my sister. The greatest peace a believer can experience is this: when your heart finally stops depending on people for emotional survival. Because people change, feelings change, attention changes, but Allah never changes. And perhaps this entire season of emotional detachment was never meant to destroy you. Perhaps Allah was teaching your soul one final lesson: that no human being can carry your heart the way He can. Subhanallah, once Allah becomes the center of your emotional world, something powerful happens inside you. You still love people, but you no longer collapse when they become distant. You still care deeply, but your peace no longer depends on their attention. You stop begging to be chosen, stop chasing validation, stop fearing abandonment every second. Because your soul finally understands, if you have Allah, you are never truly alone. And wallahi, that realization changes everything. Because people lose the power to emotionally destroy you once your heart becomes attached to Allah more than creation. Not because you became cold, but because your soul finally found the peace it was searching for in people all along, a peace that only Allah can give. My brother, my sister, if people suddenly feel distant from your heart lately, do not panic. Not every loss of attachment is a punishment. Sometimes Allah removes emotional dependence from your soul because He wants you to finally experience peace that does not break when people change. And maybe this season of detachment is not the end of your happiness. Maybe it is the beginning of your return to Allah. Because wallahi, when Allah becomes enough for your heart, people lose the power to destroy your peace.